We're live streaming this to 6 community colleges and to Cal State Long Beach and to San Francisco State University. Yes. So Cal State Long Beach and San Francisco State are also build sites, and so they'll be joining us by live stream thanks to our technicians. And then we have 6 community college pipeline partners, and they also have this live feed coming to them. Got it. Okay, well, so thank you very much for coming here. Again, I want to point out that when we have the question and answer, if you just yell your question out, it won't wind up anywhere else on the live feed, so please do go to the microphone. Good morning, and thank you for coming to hear Tim Wise. I'm Carrie Sattermo from Build Poder, an undergraduate biomedical research training program funded by the National Institutes of Health. I'm hoping that those of you who are freshmen and sophomores will check out our Build Poder website, because we are accepting applications to conduct research and make social change until February 5th. Please join us and build yourself an amazing future. I want to provide just a bit of context so that you kind of know who we are and what it is, why we're asking you to think a little bit about privilege. Build Poder's research training is based on critical race theory, which has its roots in the civil rights and critical legal studies movements, where it provided a framework to critically interrogate how law reproduces, reifies, and normalizes racism in society. Along with my partner, Gabriela Chavira, and Chris Kachikian and Maggie Shafrar, we recognize that while we've made some progress, inequities are ubiquitous in education, and we want to be part of social change. C. Wright Mills coined the phrase sociological imagination to describe the seemingly invisible structures that keep us from realizing our own power. Build Poder takes a social justice approach to health and health disparities by encouraging a sociological imagination in faculty and students to imagine the power of framing research questions and methods from the perspective of the communities we serve. We recognize that students, staff, faculty, and administrators of color are constantly taking risks to empower themselves in the midst of structures that limit their opportunities, attempt to humiliate and degrade them, and limit their voice in the very intellectual arenas where we need them to be full participants in science and in research. So I'm asking all of us, regardless of our socially constructed categories, to employ our privilege, to take a risk every day, to point out structural inequities, to help students understand how structures influence individuals, and to help them believe that individuals can unite to change the structures to be equitable. By being open to new ways of respecting and mentoring one another, we can build new scientific paradigms that allow for the knowledge and ideas of our talented students to enter our work. I want to say a few thanks and let you know that if you need anything, our volunteers have armbands. I want to thank very much all of our volunteers. There's over 30 volunteers today. I want to thank the NIH, Pamela Thornton and Robin Broughton, President Harrison and Provost Lee. I want to especially thank my dear friends Gabriela Chavira and Juana Mora. They helped this event take place. I want to thank Kathy Smith, and I want to give a really big thank you to Vanessa Cisneros, who supported this event. This would never happen without Vanessa. I want to thank Professors Sarah Mounts, Jose Paez, and Dimpal Jain. They ran at 9:30 an experimental privilege spectrum, and to Kenya Covington for her privilege essay project. And I told you we have 6 community colleges, we have 2 Cal States. I wanted to mention that unfortunately our book signing will not be able to take place because we don't have, I guess Tim is so popular he sold out his books, so there are no books today. But we'll try to figure out something for that. I want to point out that the White Privilege Room and the South Valley Room is definitely something to look at and see. We have tours there after the speech every 15 minutes. So without further ado, please let me introduce a rising star at CSUN, Dr. Sarah Mounts of the Department of Social Work, who is going to introduce Tim Wise. Thank you.
Good morning. It's my great pleasure today to welcome to our campus community prominent anti-racist writer and educator Tim Wise. Named one of the 25 visionaries who are changing your world by Utne Reader, Tim is the author of 6 books, including, among others, his most recent book, Under the Affluence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Jeopardizing the Future of America, and his highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Tim's work critiques the ideology of colorblindness. Colorblindness, he argues, is a key factor in the perpetuation of racial inequity in the United States and represses open discussion of racism and racial privilege. This is a message of critical importance given our current and historical moment. Across the nation, students of color are voicing outrage at the injustices they face on college campuses. Their acts of resistance are tied to contemporary and historical racial struggles, and they're a powerful reminder of the ways that our institutions of higher learning continue to center whiteness and dominant cultural norms. Given Bill Putter's dual goals of institutional change and transforming the ways that we mentor students in biomedical sciences, Tim's presence will hopefully spur a discussion about privilege and our own campus climate. Please join me in welcoming Tim Wise.
Thank you very much. Well, it's good to be here. It's the first time I've been on the campus in about 12 years. I was here last for an afternoon presentation, actually the day in 03, I guess it would have been in March, that the Iraq War started. And it's interesting to see that 12 years later, certain things continue to resonate and continue to exist, and certain conflicts that many of us knew at the time were not going to go anywhere, indeed haven't, and some new ones have emerged. And so it, I think, goes to show the importance of having conversations about issues of equity and justice, because these themes that I address and that so many of you address in your classrooms and every day really do continue to come back around again. So I'm glad to be able to share time with you. It's a fantastic turnout, by the way. I can gather from this turnout that one of two things is true. Either there is an intense amount of interest in issues of racial equity and justice at Northridge, or alternatively, extra credit still counts for something in higher education. And I'm cool with it either way. Like, I don't care. Like, if you're here for the extra credit, that's fine, man, because the lights are up, and so if you get up to leave, I'm going to notice, and I'll probably call it out. And that's some tacky shit. Don't do that, right? Just hang out. It's just an hour or so of your time. You're never going to get it back, but it's not going to be too painful, I promise, right? Not any more so than it has to be, given the subject matter that we'll be discussing. When I was coming in, I did see, the white privilege room, which is and I walked in, and it's a really excellent educational opportunity. But I have to be honest, I did chuckle when I first saw it, right? Because I just had this image of white folks on the campus, walking by it and going, oh shit, I need to stop in and get my weekly allotment right there in that room. That's where I go to get more of that, so. By the way, white people, if that's what you think it is, that's totally not what it is. But you should still stop in, right? You should take advantage of the educational opportunity being afforded in that space. I also want to, before I start, I want to acknowledge the irony of this, because it's relatively important that I acknowledge it. And when I say the irony of this, I mean the irony of having to have a white guy come and tell you about stuff that every single person of color on this campus has probably been trying to tell the rest of us forever, every single day. Now, I'm glad to do it, and I think, in fact, it's my obligation to do it as a white aspiring ally, but the reality is that if we could just learn to listen to people of color, right, the first time that they bring up issues of racial injustice and inequality, or the second time, maybe, being ecumenical, giving it a little moment, to sink in, then we wouldn't have to get to the place where white folks have to come filter truth for you, right? But that's where we are. And on the one hand, I'm happy to be able to do it, but the real sign of progress, right, is going to be that day when the folks of color in this room, who I assure you know every bit as much, more so in fact, than I do about the subject matter I'll be discussing, can stand up here or in your classrooms and say all of the same things, raise all of the same issues, and get the same fantastic response that I just know I'm going to get when I'm done, right? Because that's really where we have to get as a people. I'm more than happy to try to filter some of this and bring some of this in a language that maybe other white folks can hear. And sadly, even some people of color hear it more easily from white folks, which is a whole nother issue of internalized oppression that we have to deal with. But in the long run, we have to be willing to hear truth from unlikely sources and those who we normally ignore, not just those who normally get value. Because this right here, my being here on this stage with this microphone, is a manifestation of white privilege as well. I'm aware of that. And we all need to be aware of that. That doesn't mean we don't do the work, those of us who are white. Just like being a man, I can speak out about sexism, patriarchy, and rape culture and be taken more seriously than women. That doesn't mean I shouldn't do it, but it does mean that I have a responsibility, as would any man doing that work, and any white person doing this work, to at least acknowledge, at the very least, acknowledge the privilege that's embedded, call that out, problematize that, and ask us to move toward a different place where that truth doesn't have to come from people who fit this aesthetic, right? So I just wanted to say that up front as a bit of a disclaimer, so you won't take me too seriously, and I won't take myself too seriously. Like, I know my shit. I'm going to show you in a minute. Like, I know my shit. But there are a lot of folks in this room who also know their shit, and it's about being able to hear them. We are here gathered at a very dangerous time in our country's history, maybe more so than we realize, right? It is a time of both great promise and also great turmoil. On the one hand, we do, as you heard in the introduction, we have students all over this country rising up on their campuses, young people, mostly of color, rising up in their communities to protest various manifestations of racial oppression, whether it's at the hands of law enforcement or in K-12 education or on a college campus, right? And it's happening in town after town and on campus after campus after campus. On the one hand, that's incredibly invigorating, incredibly important, and it is nice to see that in regard to many of those protests and uprising against police misconduct and violence in communities of color, there have indeed been white folks who have been joining that struggle as well, so that's good. And yet at the same time that we see those uprisings and we see those rebellions and we see so many young folks of color and their white allies gathering to demand justice, we also see what? We see a countervailing trend of backlash, a countervailing trend of fear and resentment and anxiety, and it matches almost one for one the uprising of those persons of color. For every one of those uprisings, there's more hate activity on campus in response to it. For every Black Lives Matter event, there's somebody who wants to blame BLM for violence against cops, even as violence against police is at a 40-year low this year. Right? Contrary to the propaganda within the media and on the right, violence against cops is not increasing, and none of it is being done by Black Lives Matter activists, but that's the line, that's the backlash, even as this last few days we saw what? An officer killed in Colorado Springs, not by Black Lives Matter, not by anyone fighting for racial justice, but by a hateful, misogynistic, so-called evangelical Christian who believed it was his duty to shut down Planned Parenthood and killed a cop in the process. That's the real threat, not those demanding racial justice, but those who want to continue gender injustice and patriarchal oppression of women when they seek to control their own reproduction. See, that's the narrative, but that backlash is quite real. And we have to be prepared for it. At the same time, we have all of these folks rising up and demanding justice be done to our immigrant communities, whether it's the Dreamers, whether it's folks who are demanding the cessation of deportations of their family, the splitting up of families. We have what? An increased backlash against immigrants, particularly undocumented persons, but only those coming over one particular border, because we never mind the other border. The Minutemen do not camp out in Nova Scotia in boats seeking to shoot those crafty, sneaky Canadians as they try to come into our country to take advantage of our healthcare system, which would make no sense for them to do. They only worry about that one border, I should remind you, an artificial border created at the end of a war of aggression that this country started on false pretense. I should remind you, if you need reminding, that the people coming back over that border are, in a very literal sense, only coming home. Their people were here before our people were here. In fact, if there's any people that can truly claim to be American, it would be Latino and Latina folk, because they are indeed an amalgam of what? Europeans and indigenous people of this continent. Even the indigenous of the continent had to cross a land strait, but Latino folk are truly able to trace their origin to this land. They are as American or more so than anyone else, and yet we dare say that they cannot come home. That would be like me coming to your house, putting all your shit in the street, and then when you insisted that you would like to come back, looking at you and telling you that I had changed the lock and calling that justice. That is not justice, and yet this backlash is real, right? Folks running around leading the pack in a presidential campaign by saying that they're going to do what? Build a wall, but not just any wall, not just any wall, right? A wall like you wouldn't believe. Because everything he does is like I wouldn't believe. That's his line. I don't even know what the hell that means. What does that mean? I'm going to fight ISIS like you wouldn't believe. I'm going to support veterans like you wouldn't believe. I'm going to build a wall like you wouldn't believe. What the hell is a wall? If there are any Trump translators in this room, what the hell is a wall that I wouldn't believe? The only wall that I wouldn't believe is a wall made of butter. Is that what he's talking about? Is he going to build a butter wall? Because I totally don't believe that. Like, I don't think that shit will work at all. Like, butter is going to melt in the southwest sun. You can't build a wall out of butter. Is that what he means? I mean, he says things like, who builds walls better than Trump? I don't know anybody. Trump's never built a wall. He builds casinos. He builds hotels. And actually, Donald Trump doesn't build anything. He gets brown people to do that for him, probably half of whom are undocumented. Important point worth noting. But this backlash is real against Syrian refugees because, we can't have them. We can't have them. They'll be terrorists, even though the process for getting refugee status is the most vetted process that it takes to come into a country. It's more difficult than just about any other process. It takes 18 to 24 months of UN inspection and evaluation before the United States even begins its own process. So we're talking 2.5, even 3 years to get refugee status. But we've done what? We've racialized Islam. Right, so folks want to separate what's going on from racism because, no, that's just Islamophobia. Understand, those two things are the same. We've racialized Islam, right? Certainly in a post-9/11 environment, I would say we had done it even before that, right? So much so that, like, when the Boston Marathon bombing happened, nobody wanted to admit those two guys were white, right? Like, well, they're not white. Well, yeah, they're from the Caucasus Mountain region, Jack. That's where we got our anthropological name from. What the hell? Like, we call ourselves Caucasians. Those dudes are Caucasian, right? Most of us who are white, we're not even from that region. They're whiter than most of us, right? But in the media and in the coverage, right, they were browned in the public imagination because Islam has been racialized. So all of this backlash to Muslim refugees from Syria, all this backlash to brown folk coming over that artificial border, all this backlash to black folk out in the street demanding that Black Lives Matter, happening at the same time as all of this inspiring activism. So it's both exciting and exhilarating, but also a very anxious moment, and we need to acknowledge that anxiety and think about how we're going to move through it. And this anxiety, I think, and the danger associated with it is intensified by our unwillingness as a people, and I mean that both in the sense of, sort of the U.S. American people writ large, but specifically drilling down white folks in particular, to be honest about our history and its effect on the present, right? We are an incredibly ahistorical people. We don't believe in history, and we've never learned anything from it. It's rather obvious, right? We are, for lack of a better way of thinking of it, Snapchat nation, right? Like if Snapchat were a country, it'd be us, right? Because what does Snapchat do? You send a video to your friend, it lasts for 10 seconds or whatever, and then it's gone forever, right? Like the past is the past. I don't need to remember it. I don't need to archive it. I don't need to save it in my memory. I looked at it, that's funny, and then it's gone. Right? That's how we do history, right? So shit that happened last week doesn't even matter now, let alone if it happened 100 years ago. That's why folks will say things like, well, why can't people just get over the history of racism? Why can't black folks get over enslavement? Why can't brown folk get over the theft of land? Why can't indigenous people get over genocide? I don't know. Why the hell can't you get over July 4th? Independence Day, that's some old shit. We broke away from the British a long ass time ago. That wasn't last Tuesday. Why are we still celebrating that? Why? Because we don't like to let go of the past when it makes us feel good. We love to live in the past. We'd like to go back there. Some folks tell you that. I want my country back. The hell is that? That's a directional reference to the past. When you say you want it back, you mean you want to go back in time to some fictive period that you think was so fantastic, right? So what is that? That's people that want to live in the past. We love the past as long as it venerates us, as long as it makes us feel superior to other people. But God forbid we talk about a past that brings us up a little short, and then all of a sudden people get pissy about it and tell folks to move on, right? But unless we understand the past, and I don't just mean the ancient past, I don't mean just the last couple of hundred years past, I mean even just the very recent past, it's very hard to understand what's going on in the present, right? So if you're looking at those campus uprisings and you don't understand all that came before, it seems odd to you. Now, I've been going around college campuses for 20 years giving talks about race, and none of the stuff that we're hearing coming out of the University of Missouri, none of the stuff that we're hearing coming out of Yale, coming out of Princeton, coming out of all these campuses around the country where you're seeing these uprisings, none of it's new. None of the stories that the students at Mizzou were sharing about the racial slurs to which they are regularly subjected, not just students, but also professional staff and faculty in that institution, none of that's new. I've been hearing that at every college I have visited for 20 years. There's not one place where I don't hear those stories. But unless you have had the luxury of being in that position that I've been, where I get to meet people who share those stories with me, and then I choose to believe them, unless you have that luxury, you haven't heard that. So all of a sudden you hear about one or two things and you think, well, why are they so angry? It's just one or two isolated incidents. Why? Because you don't know the history. You've never had to hear the history. You've never had to hear the voices that I have to hear by virtue of what I do for a living. Most people don't. So even if they're good people who are compassionate and empathetic individuals, if they've never had to hear the narrative, we can't really be surprised when they act stunned. Well, what's all this about? Why, this is crazy. Why is this happening now? Well, it's happening now because it's been building for a very, very long time. And the luxury that white folks have had to not hear it, right, is now starting to cause problems for us. We had this privilege of being oblivious. And now people of color have said, enough of that. We're taking that privilege from you. Right? That's the one power folks of color have. We can take your privilege of being oblivious because we can force you to hear, right? And that's been building for a very long time, but we've had that luxury of tamping it down, putting our fingers in our ears like a 4-year-old, la, 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 I don't want to hear it, right? And now people of color have figured out there are some ways to organize in this modern era, particularly in the era of social media, particularly in the era of the internet, right, that they can get that word out. 20 years ago, it would have been harder. Right? 20 years ago when there was stuff going on campus, you had to find some magazine to print it or some, you didn't have websites, you certainly didn't have social media. It was hard to get that voice out there. Now folks of color and activists of all colors on all kinds of different issues have these outlets, so that's a positive development. The problem is it's got some people freaking out. They can't figure out what's going on because they've had all of this time to be oblivious, right? Same thing is true with police misconduct, right? After Ferguson, all of a sudden you have all these uprisings and an awful lot of white Americans were just like, what's going on? Why are they so angry? Why are black folks so angry with police? See, what world do you live in that question even makes any sense to you? I understand why you might ask that when you're 13 and white in America, right? But if you're still asking that question at 30 and at 40 and at 50, then somewhere along the line you didn't get educated. How can you grow up in this country and not understand the way in which people of color have experienced law enforcement? Well, the answer is it's very easy to grow up in this country and not know anything about that because nobody teaches that to you, right? And you're not going to know what you weren't taught. So all of a sudden it seems like this stuff comes out of the blue. Everybody thinks it's just about Mike Brown or it's just about Tamir Rice or it's just about John Crawford or it's just about Rekia Boyd, right? But all this stuff had been going on for a long time. See, what black and brown folks know that white folks have had the luxury of never, ever having to learn is that the history of law enforcement has been the history of oppression of people of color. Right? Modern policing traces itself to what? Slave patrols. That's the first experience that black folks in this country have with law enforcement. And then you fast forward a little bit beyond that, and after emancipation so-called, then you have what? The black codes also enforced by law enforcement, taking folks that didn't have any money, arresting them for vagrancy, and then basically putting them back on the very plantations from which their families had been liberated to work off their debt. See, that's law enforcement. But we don't learn about that. Or we treat it like Snapchat. which is to say that shit happened a long time ago. I looked at it for 10 seconds and now it's gone, right? People of color know that history. They know that, in fact, law enforcement was involved in every single riot that took place in this country in black communities, and there were dozens of them. From the very beginning of the 20th century all the way through the 1940s, dozens of riots, in fact, that's not even the right term, pogrom is the right term, right? White folks going into black communities, usually successful, thriving, economically productive black communities, and burning them to the ground in places like Tulsa or places like East St. Louis, Illinois. 137 people killed, including 38 children in 1919 in a riot that cops helped facilitate. See, people of color know that history. Brown folk in Los Angeles know the history of the Zoot Suit riots. If you don't, you should Google that shit. Because that was cops and military folk busting brown folks' ass because of their racism and their xenophobia. And so people of color know that. People of color know that it was cops who were pulling protesters off those stools in the South during the civil rights struggle to enforce white man segregation, right? They know that it was cops who were involved in the killing of 27 members of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s and early 1970s. Police did that. And people of color know that history. Our indigenous brothers and sisters know what law enforcement did to the American Indian movement and has done to indigenous people all throughout the country's history. You cannot be black or brown in America and not have a sense of that, and you surely cannot grow up in Los Angeles and not know about the Rampart scandal. I mean, I guess you could, because they won't talk about it in school, but many of y'all remember this. I remember back in 95 when OJ was on trial, right? The first time. I know he's been on trial a couple times. I'm talking about the first one, the murder trial, right? And you'll recall, or maybe you won't, but you know the history, that when OJ was acquitted of murder in that case, there was a big racial divide, right? In terms of how people felt about the case. Now, about 2/3 of black folk polled said that they agreed with the verdict of not guilty. Didn't mean that 2/3 thought he didn't do it. Let's be clear. I talked to a lot of black folk that were like, yeah, I think he did that shit. But you have certain standards of evidence. This is your system. You created this system. You created this particular burden of proof, and then you botch the case because you put a guy up who's the lead detective who has a history of racism. You get him to own that on the stand, and the black folks on the jury are like, what the hell? Right? Because if you got a guy who found the blood evidence who has a history of racism, to black folks, alarm bells are going to go off. But to white folks, they don't, because it's a different relationship that we have to cops. So 2/3 of black folks agreed with the verdict. 2/3 of white folks thought it was the biggest miscarriage of justice in the history of the legal system. My God, how could this happen? How could this person get off? He's so obviously guilty. And they made it about, the irrationality of black people. How could you believe cops would plant evidence? How could you believe that? That's irrational. Putting aside the history of the LAPD prior to 95, all we have to do is stick around Los Angeles for 4 more years when the Rampart scandal breaks. And what was the Rampart scandal, right? It's a scandal involving a division of the LAPD where they had dozens of instances where, in fact, evidence was planted on criminal suspects, either to frame them outright or to sweeten the cases against them. Now, that doesn't mean that happened to OJ. But it does mean that when black folks thought that shit might happen, they weren't crazy either, right? They were actually perceptive of their social reality, and it was white folks who thought it was irrational because to us, for the most part, with some exceptions duly noted, because I know that cops have treated working class and poor white folks like crap as well all throughout history, and that's ironic because so many of them are working class themselves. Right? But by and large, for us in our communities, police are the folks that come and get your cat out the tree. Or give your 14-year-old son a ride around in the car to show him how gosh darn cool it is to be an officer. That is not the black and brown experience with law enforcement, whether in Los Angeles or elsewhere. So if we don't know that history, though, we don't understand why are they so angry, or why do they run from police? That's the other good one. See, this is that colorblind, and when I say colorblind, I don't mean really color, because white folks, we see color. Let's not pretend. Like, we're not color, we're white blind. We don't see whiteness very much, even though it's all around us, we ignore it. But when I say we're colorblind, I mean we're blind to the consequences of color. So to say why do black folks run from police makes sense if you don't know the history of black folks' relationship with police, because if I'm confronted as a black or brown person in this country by law enforcement, I have to process things a little differently. This could go badly. even if I do nothing. So it may not be smart to run from a cop, because we know that cops don't respond well to you running on them, right? We understand that. And yet the fact that it may not be a good move doesn't mean that it's not rational given the history, right? If I have to process it, maybe I got a better chance of not getting beat, not getting arrested on some bullshit, not getting killed if I run than if I stick around and try to be polite. And to us, that doesn't make sense, because if you're just polite to police, everything will be fine, right? But that's not the black or brown experience. It just isn't. Right now, we know, for instance, that folks of color are about twice as likely as white folks to be killed by cops when unarmed, posing no direct threat, right? So it's not just that there's disproportionality in general in terms of how police interact with black and brown communities, but specifically when unarmed, more likely to be considered a threat. So that means if I'm an unarmed young person of color, male or female in this country, confronted by police knowing that I'm doing nothing wrong, I cannot take for granted that that will be understood by that officer. But once again, white folks have the luxury of not knowing any of that. And when you have that luxury, because that ignorance is built into the system, like this is cultivated ignorance. And I want us to understand, I'm not trying to bash white folks for our ignorance. This is about systemically ingrained ignorance. You're not supposed to know it, right? So this is not about bashing white people. Sometimes people get twisted on that and they think that I'm like, I hate white people or some shit. Like, he hates white people. No, I love me some white people. Love me some white people, right? Like my wife is white, love her. Our daughters, white girls, love them. My mom, like my favorite person, nice white lady, love her. My dad, he and I don't get along, but it's not because he's white, it's about some other shit that we don't have time to get into, right? It's not about white people, it's about whiteness. It's about how a system of whiteness and white domination, white supremacy, not only marginalizes and oppresses people of color who don't fit within it, but also keeps from those of us who were called white the truth about how the system is operating so that we never question it, you see. So I'm not trying to blame white folks for being ignorant, I'm just saying we gotta get clear now, you see. It's not your fault for not knowing, it's only your fault for continuing to not know even when the evidence is presented to you. And that's our problem, right? Is that we just don't want to see it, or we want to see it again like Snapchat for only 10 seconds and then move along. But white America has the privilege of being oblivious, and we always have, right? So just this last week, there's a poll comes out, CNN, Kaiser Family Foundation poll, which just like every poll that's been taken in the last forever, right? Shows what? That there's a big divide between how white folks and how people of color consider racism to either be or not be a big problem. Now, there were some bright spots in the poll where white folks seemed to be at least slightly more willing to acknowledge some inequality than maybe 10 or 15 years ago, probably because it's in the news and it's hard to run away from, so that part was sort of good. But there was still a large divide, right, between white folks who were willing to say yes, that racism is still a big problem. Only about 40% roughly thought it was, as opposed to 85% of African Americans and 2/3 or so of Latinos, for instance. So a big gap. And there was even a big gap among white folks not being willing to just acknowledge racism itself, but even being able to acknowledge inequality between groups in terms of opportunity or just sort of where we are, right? So putting aside discrimination as the cause, according to the survey data, at least half of white folks don't even think that people of color are worse off at all, right? So when they break it, like whether you're talking about employment or income or health outcomes or education, right? At least half of white folks refuse to believe that white folks are better off in those categories, that they're healthier, have higher income, less likely to be out of work. Most white folks, apparently, according to the data, believe that things are truly equal in terms of where we sit on the spectrum of benefits and opportunity. But what does the data really tell us? The data that we're not wanting to see. Well, the data tells us that in every category of well-being, people of color lag behind white folks, right? And of course, the research tells us much of the reason for that is discrimination, both past and present. But let's just be clear about the inequities, right? So right now, for instance, according to the Labor Department, black folks with a college degree who are recent graduates, 22 to 27 years old, so theoretically, you would think these are black folks who have had more opportunity than past generations, if we accept the notion that things are at least getting somewhat better. And yet, black folks, recent grads, 22 to 27, 2.25 times more likely than recent white college grads to be unemployed. regardless of their major, by the way. Even when you only compare engineering majors with engineering majors, education majors with education majors, biology majors with biology majors, psychology with psychology, 2 to 2.25 times more likely to be out of work if you're black, right? Overall, Latino folk with a degree, about 50% more likely than white folks with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with a degree, about 25% more likely than comparable white folks with a degree to be out of work. So what does that tell us? Well, number one, it tells us that there's ongoing inequality in the labor market that we need to be prepared to investigate and figure out where that's coming from, right? But it also does a lot to debunk all this nonsense about reverse racism and reverse discrimination. Like, I got this email a month ago from this dude, royally pissed off, right? He'd read some, and I knew he was pissed because the email was like capital letters and red font and shit. But let me just say, like, if you're pissed about my talk today, don't write me in some red font. I'm going to delete that shit. Just send me a regular email in nice small letters, and, don't scream at me because I don't have time for that. But somehow I did have time for it, and I read this guy's email. And he said, starts talking about, I can't find a job because black and Mexican folks have taken all the jobs. What the hell jobs have black and Mexican folks taken? Where are these jobs? Are they in Second Life? Where are these jobs? Like, are they on Minecraft? Where the hell are these jobs? Like, because if people of color are twice as likely as white folks to be unemployed, whatever jobs they're taking from white, they must not be taking them very far. They get them, they take them down the block, and then they just drop them. I mean, what jobs are they taking? But this young man really believed it because he can't find work. And his assumption is he can't find work because black and brown folk took his job. Now, first of all, that's ironic, right? First of all, you say, they took my job. My initial question is like, did you already have the job? Because if you didn't have the job, that shit was not your job. They didn't take your job, they got a job. You just thought it was yours because you have entitlement mentality issues, right? They didn't take your job. You didn't have the damn thing. I mean, if white folks were like getting a job on Monday and then Thursday they were getting fired, and that would be sort of wrong, I suppose. But that's not what's happening. This young man's having trouble, and his troubles are real. I'm not trying to demean his situation. I have no doubt that he's having a hard time finding work. Maybe because he's sort of an asshole, but maybe not, right? Maybe he's just frustrated. But you know what? It's not brown folk taking those jobs. It's corporations sending those jobs overseas to take advantage of lower working conditions and lower wages and no labor unions. It's because we have a low-wage economy that's predicated on marginalizing working class people. So you can have the biggest employer in this country, Walmart, right, paying a disproportionate number of their employees sub-poverty wages so low that they have to actually turn to SNAP, or what we used to call food stamp benefits, to feed their families. In most communities, the largest single demographic chunk of SNAP beneficiaries are Walmart and McDonald's employees. The hell kind of system do we live in where companies get taxpayers to subsidize the low wages of their workers? Because that's what that means, right? It means that Walmart, one of the wealthiest companies in the history of money, right, is paying their people so little, and then they're turning to us to provide the benefits that they wouldn't even need to get if Walmart would just pay a livable wage. Meanwhile, the 6 heirs to the Walmart fortune, 6 of them, 5 of whom were born into the family, 1 of whom, Christy Walton, married in, have so much wealth that the 6 of them have the same combined net worth as the poorest 40% of the American people. 6 people and 127 million people with the same net worth. Right? 6 people versus 127 million people. That's that young man's problem. An economy predicated on low or no wage employment. His problem is not black and brown folks. It's people at the top who have continued to take a greater and greater share of the wealth of this country at the expense of the people who work and actually create it, see? But he's been encouraged, right, in this environment of backlash to scapegoat the wrong people for the problem. And so that's where we are. But we have the luxury, again, of being oblivious to that history. So we don't have to know any of that information. We don't have to know, for instance, that right now the typical white family in America, right in the midpoint, has about 18 times the net worth of the typical black family, 14 times that of the typical Latino family. It's not because we worked harder. It's not because we saved money better, and it's not because white people are better investors. Like, if you didn't pay any attention to all that shit that happened on Wall Street, at least learn this lesson, right? White folks can lose a hell of a lot of money without any help from black people. without any help from Latinos or Asian Americans or indigenous folk, just a handful of the smartest, highest SAT getting white men on Wall Street lost $12.5 trillion of other people's money in 18 months. That's 20% of the net worth of this country that it took over 230 years to accumulate. These white boys wiped it out in a year and a half. And every time I say that, people get nervous. They're like, why does he have to mention that they were white? That's sort of racist. No, that shit is not racist. It is descriptive, right? And if they had been black, everybody would have noticed. If a bunch of Latino folk jacked $12.5 trillion of other people's money, you telling me nobody would have pointed out that they were brown, that nobody would have brought that up? Everybody would have brought that up. They would have said, how did these people of color get these jobs on Wall Street? Oh, I know. They got them because of affirmative action. But when white boys wrecked the economy and destroy 20% of the nation's net worth, no one puts it on white people. I'm not saying that we should. I'm not saying they did that because they were white. I'm just pointing out the double standard, right? People of color get to answer for every single thing one of theirs does. And white folks don't have to answer for any of that. We don't have to answer for Wall Street. We don't have to answer for Charles Manson, right? Just a potted plant. Leave him alone. He doesn't represent white people. Jeffrey Dahmer eating people. No, that's not me. That's that crazy fool. That's not me. That guy that shot up Planned Parenthood, he doesn't have to stand in for all Christians. Nobody's asking Christian pastors in white churches to denounce him just to prove that they're not terrorists, but we damn sure do that every time someone who's Muslim commits a terrorist act. We need every imam in the world and every practicing Muslim in the world to stand up and condemn it. We don't do that when it's ours, see? That's privilege, and we have the privilege of not thinking about any of that. We have the privilege of not knowing, going back to the police issue, the way that black folks experience this so-called war on drugs, which is not, as you know, a war on drugs. Right? If it were a war on drugs, I don't know who'd be giving this talk to you, but it wouldn't be me. Because I don't think they let you Skype in a lecture from prison, and that's where I'd sure as hell be if the war on drugs were actually about narcotics. And I can tell you this now because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit, so can't touch me now. And I don't do any of that stuff anymore. My asthma came back, I'm done, I'm good, but I'm saying, like, there was a time, you understand? The war on drugs is not about drugs. We know this. We know that white folks, for instance, use illegal narcotics and sell illegal narcotics at rates that are equal to or higher, according to the research, than black and Latino folk. But we know that black folk 4 times more likely than white folk to be arrested for weed, 5 to 9 times more likely overall to be incarcerated for a drug offense. We know that black and Latino folk combined are only about 23% of all drug users, but they represent well over 38% of the people who are arrested for a drug possession offense, well over half of all the people incarcerated for one, right? So we know it's not about drugs. In fact, a couple months ago, I decided I wanted to find out, right, just how big a problem this was. How I wanted to quantify it, because sometimes when you say, oh, this group is 4 times more likely to get arrested than this group, it's interesting, but our eyes sort of glaze over. It doesn't really get to the human element to this. So I wanted to figure out, like, what does that really mean, right? So I decided I would go and look at the FBI data, which tells you how many people got arrested last year for drug possession. And keep in mind, when it comes to drug arrest in this country, 83%, almost all of them, are just for simple possession. It's not for intent to distribute, it's not for manufacturing, it's just possession, right? 83%. That when you look at the arrest data, you can see how many black folks were arrested, how many white folks, right? And then you can look at the data from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, right, that'll tell you the usage rates, right? And then you can compare these, because the usage rate numbers basically are a good raw aggregate of how many people are breaking drug laws, right? So now I know who's violating the law in what percentages, and over here I know who's being arrested. Then I can compare those, yes? And I can determine, based on that comparison, how many more black folks are being arrested each year who wouldn't be arrested but for the racial inequality in the so-called drug war. I can actually come up with a number of the excess arrest of black folks relative to their rates of breaking the law. And then I can look at the white numbers and do the same. I can find out how many white folks aren't getting arrested who would have gotten arrested if they were arrested in the same proportion as they break the law. In other words, if there was no racism in the drug war. So when I did that, what I was able to determine, conservatively guessing that about 160,000 black people every year in this country are arrested who would not be arrested but for the racial disproportionality of the drug war. And 160,000 white folks are not arrested who would be arrested except for the racial disproportionality in the drug war. Now, let's extrapolate that out over a 10-year period and see what we have, right? What does that mean? It means that over a course of a decade, roughly 1.6 million black folks have records who wouldn't have them but for a system of racism. And 1.6 million white folks don't have records who would have records but for privilege within the system. Now you tell me what that would look like if that were the reality after 10 years. What would it do to the job market? Because those 1.6 million white folks who now have a record, if they'd been arrested, they're gonna have a harder time finding work because they're not gonna hire you if you have a record. What would it mean for who's in college and who's not? Because you're not gonna get that student loan if you got a record, right? What would it mean in terms of the ability to access various public services, which they will not let you access if you have a record? What would it mean for voting? Right? Because you certainly are not allowed to vote in most cases while you're in jail or prison. You certainly, in many cases, not allowed to even on probation or parole. And in a handful of states, if you have a felony conviction, you can never vote again. And this ends up disproportionately affecting whom? People of color. But if we had 1.6 million more white folks in this country in the last 10 years walking around with a record, that would change the whole outlook of who's in school, who has a job and who doesn't, who's able to vote and who isn't. See, this is a real thing with real consequences that we have to face. Of course, the reality is, if we had arrested 1.6 million more white folks over the last 10 years for drugs, the war on drugs would have been called the hell off, wouldn't it? Because we're not gonna let our babies go to prison in numbers like that, you see? Would have been called off. And then we have every state like Colorado where a handful of white men are becoming millionaires selling stuff that black and brown folks are sitting in prison for right now, selling the same drug, but they just didn't have the startup money to get an office building, to get an occupational license, and to get a storefront to sell weed. It's crazy, right? You go to Colorado and go to these weed shops and they got like, I mean, this is crazy. White people, when we sell weed, it's crazy. Like, you go in, they have like tasting notes for weed. The hell, it's like, this one has apricot undercurrent. What the hell? Like, back in the day, it was just weed. Like, it was either good or it was shitty. Like, that was it. Those were the two flavors, good and shitty. And now it's like pomegranate, apricot, kiwi, crazy shit. And white people, and they like smelling it, sniffing it, like putting it in their mouth like it's like candy and spitting it out. I mean, it's like wine. They're treating it like it's nuts. And then they're making millions of dollars. All these new entrepreneurs selling legal weed while black and brown folks in that state and every other state that is legalized in part or in whole, you know full well, in this state sitting in prison for doing the very same thing. See, as long as white folks are able to make money selling legal weed in any state in this country, every black or brown person sitting in jail for selling the same stuff should be released yesterday. Yesterday. And then the money that those white folks make selling all that legal weed, a portion of their profit should be put back into the communities that were devastated by the war on drugs to help bring those folks home and get them back on their feet, find them housing and jobs. See, that's what justice would demand. But that's not what we do because we don't have to think about history. So what happened to those people was just affecting them, and what happens to us just affects us, and the two things have no relationship to one another, but of course they do, right? The problem is that this obliviousness is a really long trend. It's not something that just happened. So on the one hand, like, it almost makes sense when white folks don't get it today. I sort of understand in 2015 how particularly a young white person might think that racism is sort of a thing of the past because we have all these outward manifestations of progress, whether it's a president of color, pop culture icons of color, whatever, right? A very multicultural popular culture that seems to be, you know, very hybridized across racial and ethnic lines. So if that's all you looked at, you might think, well, damn, that's real progress. And I'm not saying it's not, but let's not overstate the case. The problem is that white folks are not just in denial in 2015. We've been in denial a very long time. So 52 years ago, 1963, the year of the March on Washington, the year before the Civil Rights Act, 2 years before the Voting Rights Act, 5 years before the Fair Housing Act, the Gallup poll organization went out and they polled white folks, and they asked a large representative sample of white people, do you believe that racial minorities are treated equally in your community? Now, you know, half a century later, this is a very easy question to answer, isn't it? Like, we all know. And everybody would agree the answer is no. Of course they weren't being treated equally in 63, because it doesn't take any real courage to acknowledge that now, 52 years later. But in 1963, what do you think white folks said? 2 out of 3 said, sure, everything's fine. Right? And that was at a time when it was on the news every night. 63 is the year of the March on Washington. It's the year of the Birmingham campaign, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, the killing of those 4 little girls in that church. It's the year that George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama and said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It's the year that Medgar Evers was shot down dead in his driveway in Jackson, the Mississippi head of the NAACP. So in 1963, at the height of the movement, where it's coming into your living room every night on the television, white folks are watching the news going, I don't get it. Right? I don't get it. And in 1962, Gallup asked, do you think black children have the same chance to get a good education as white children? Once again, come on now. 1962, we know the answer is no. But at that time, when whites were asked, 85 out of 100 said yes. 85% of white folks were like, yep. Racism, what racism? Again, is that because they were bad people, our parents, our grandparents? No. Most of them weren't bad people. Most folks are good folks that don't mean harm to people. But the problem is they had the luxury of being oblivious. They didn't have to know. And when you don't have to know something because it's not on the test and they don't require that you know it, the odds are you won't know it. Like I'm oblivious to calculus. You know why? Because I didn't take that shit. That's why I didn't take it. Now, I don't mean any offense to those who teach or love calculus. I'm glad somebody likes it. Somebody has to do that. It just wasn't going to be me. And I knew that. So I started high school, and they said, you got to take 3 years of math. And I said, well, how can I construct my high school career to take 3 years of math and never take calculus? And then I came upon the idea, I'll retake Algebra 1. Then I'll take geometry. Then I'm going to take Algebra 2. And then I'm out. I'm not even taking trig, I'm done. Algebra 2, and I am never taking math again. That was my thought process. I am a genius, right? But as a result of not having taken calculus, here's what I know. If I stood up on this stage and tried to teach it to you, y'all would all be like, wait a minute. A, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And B, didn't he just tell us he never took the class? Aha. Yes, and that's exactly how identity works in this country. White folks think we know racism better than people of color, and we never had to take the damn class. You hear me? And men think we know more about sexism, patriarchy, and rape culture than women, and we didn't have to take the class. And straight and cisgendered folk think we know more about heterosexism, straight supremacy, transphobia, than LGBTQ folk, and we didn't have to take the class. Those of us who were able-bodied act like we understand ableism better than the disabled, and we didn't take the class. See, you have the luxury of being oblivious to all of those identities where you're the dominant one, right? You can walk into this room if you're able-bodied and never have to think about the obstacles and the barriers faced by folks who can't do that. Or for those of us who are hearing, right, and looking as this speech is being signed, being interpreted, we don't have to think about autism, so much so we don't even know the word autism, but that is a system of oppression against our deaf brothers and sisters. We have the luxury of knowing when we go to class, we don't have to worry about someone to interpret, right? But someone who's deaf has to think about that. Is this program going to be signed or not? I would say 80% of my talks are not. And that's no sweat off the hearing students' back, is it? But for folks who were deaf, it means what? That they're having to, and it's not, I'm not saying that if you don't think about that, you're a bad person. Like, it's got nothing to do with good people, bad people. It means that when you don't have to think about it, you're likely to remain oblivious. And then the only thing I can ask you to do is agree that those who have to take the class know more, right? Those who majored in calculus know more than me, right? Those who took a week of calculus know more than me. If people of color have had to understand racism just so as to survive, let's assume they know their life better than we know their life. If women have had to understand sexism, patriarchy, and rape culture to stay alive, then let's assume they know their truth better than we know their truth. See, really what it comes down to is that identity functions like the blue pill in The Matrix. If you remember the film The Matrix, right? There's this scene early on, the first one, because like the other two sucked. I'm talking about the first of the three, right? Really good film, right? And there's this scene early on, very central to the plot, where Keanu Reeves' character, Neo, is offered 2 pills by Lawrence Fishburne's character, right? Morpheus, and Morpheus says to Neo, and I'm paraphrasing, but you'll remember the scene if you've seen it, holds out his hand, he says, there's a blue pill and a red pill, pick. You can take the blue pill if you want, and the story ends. You go back to sleep, you can remain as oblivious as everyone else in this society. They don't want to know the truth. They're all on the blue pill, they don't know what's happening, they'd rather die than know the truth. Or you can take the red pill and you can have enlightenment, and I can take you down the rabbit hole and I can show you just how deep it goes. And if you remember the film, Neo takes the red pill, right? And he starts to see all the stuff that he never had to see before. And it blows his mind to see all the stuff that's really happening in the society. That's how identity functions. When you're a member of a dominant group, you're on the blue pill. And you don't even know you're like on a blue pill IV drip. And don't even know that it's in your arm. You're like walking around clanking this damn thing. I don't know, what is that shit? Like, and then black people and brown folks are like, do you see this racism? And we're like, nope, don't see anything. I don't know why. Maybe it's got to do with this IV, you know? And men, right, we have the luxury of being on the blue pill, and I know that means some different shit in the modern pharmaceutical era. Men on the blue pill, right? See, that's marketing right there. Y'all actually like, you see what Pfizer just did to you? They let you get that joke. That's crazy, right? That's marketing, that's commercialism, that's capitalism. So just keep in mind, the fact that you get that joke tells you somebody's doing a number on your consciousness, because I say blue pill and y'all are, I know what that is. Men have the luxury of being on the Matrix blue pill, not talking about Pfizer's blue pill, talking about the Matrix, and not having to see what women have to see on the red pill just to make sense of their lives. Same thing with straight and cisgendered folk, blue pill versus LGBTQ folk having to take the red pill, right? So part of breaking free of this is being able to just be humble enough. Humility, right, is a major weapon in this fight against white supremacy, male supremacy, class supremacy. Being humble enough to acknowledge that you've been misled and that you've had truth hidden from you, and it's not your fault, but now it is your responsibility to take charge of that truth and decide to speak truth to power and to join with people of color when they do that, right? To acknowledge, along with black folk, for instance, that black lives matter, not because other folks' lives don't, but because black lives are the ones that for so long systemically have been denied as mattering. We say that thing that we say, right? We hear that black lives matter. We say, well, all lives matter. Yes, precious. I know they do. They do. It's true. But you don't need to say that. White folks have a long history of saying all and not meaning that shit. Like we said all men are created equal. We didn't mean that shit, right? So all doesn't mean anything in the mouths of white people historically. Why would people of color think it does now? To say all lives matter as a comeback to Black Lives Matter would be sort of like in the 70s when the phrase was black is beautiful, right? Because black folks were reclaiming beauty standards that had been really limited to white and blonde and blue-eyed and all that stuff. Saying black is beautiful, it'd be like in the midst of that whole phrase coming up and saying, but we're all beautiful in our own way. Yeah, shut up, we know. You know, or like in the early 80s when the AIDS crisis, HIV crisis first touched off, and you had groups like ACT UP and Gay Men's Health Crisis out in the streets, right, demanding funding, demanding research, and they were being ignored for years by the Reagan administration that did nothing until Rock Hudson, one of Reagan's old friends, actually died of AIDS, and then all of a sudden he spoke the words or whatever. But you had these groups out there demanding, in effect, even though they weren't using this phrase, that people with AIDS lives matter, right? That was essentially the message. And to say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter would be like back in 1983, 84, in the midst of that crisis, somebody running into the middle of an ACT UP action and saying, yes, but what about pancreatic cancer? People die of that too. Shut up, we know, right? We only have to proclaim that which has been denied consistently, and that's black and brown life in this country. But again, we have the luxury of ignoring it. One more thing before I'm done. This ahistorical tendency is incredibly dangerous, and it's at the root of our current drama over issues of immigration. As much as anything, our misunderstanding of history is at the root of this. I could stand up here and I could articulate for you any number of factual pieces of information as to why the attack on immigrants from south of that artificial border are wrong-headed from a factual perspective. I could give you all the data that would rebut all the claims about Mexican immigrants and Central American immigrants taking all these resources and not paying taxes, because that's all nonsense. But that's not what I want to talk to you about, because to me, that's not the way to make the case for a humane immigration policy. It's not about whether or not the productivity increase will justify the cost of the education, whatever. I don't look at human beings as economic units whose value is determined by how much money they do or don't add to our economy. But here's what I do want to say. The only reason we're having such a hard time with this is because of both the internalization of white supremacy, which doesn't allow us to see these brown folk as our own, but also a misunderstanding of our own history as immigrants, those of us who were immigrants to this country. So let me explain what I mean by that. Folks will say things like this. First, they'll say, well, I don't mind them coming. I just want them to come the right way, legally, like my ancestors. What the hell does that even mean? Legally, like your ancestors. I beg to remind you that at the time that Europeans came to this country, there were no laws to break. So when your great-great-grandfather comes and doesn't break a law that didn't even exist, he doesn't get kudos for that. You don't get kudos for being law-abiding when there was no law for you to violate, right? And so the idea of legal versus illegal, documented versus undocumented is a political contrivance. It is only and always about power, who has the right to define who is and is not legal at a given moment. It has nothing to do with the inherent essence of the people involved. Because I'm here to tell you, if my great-grandfather who came here from Russia as an immigrant in the early 1900s had in fact, let's say Russia had been contiguous to the United States rather than on the other side of the ocean, I have absolutely no doubt that trying to feed his family and provide opportunities for his family, if Russia had been where Mexico is and he was desperate and wanted to survive and wanted his children to thrive, do you think he wouldn't have crossed that border just because of some law in place? Of course, every one of our ancestors would. The idea that our ancestors would have been like, well, I'd like to go, but there's a law, so we'll just starve, is absolutely ignorant, right? But it's, again, we don't have to think about that history. We also have the luxury of saying things like, well, the difference is our families came for the principle of freedom and liberty. And those people, they're just coming for stuff. Really? Freedom and liberty. That's not why we came. If we had come for freedom and liberty, you know what we would have done? We would have established freedom and liberty in the colonies, but we didn't. We didn't do it for African labor. We didn't do it for indigenous people. We didn't even do it for each other. You know what we did in the colonies? We burned people alive for being witches. That doesn't sound like freedom or liberty. We created laws in the colonies for unruly children that allowed them to be executed if they talked back to their parents. That's what the colonies were like. These were cesspools of religious fascism. This was not a liberty-loving people. They didn't come for liberty. You know what they came for? Stuff. Stuff called land, stuff called opportunity, stuff called the ability to keep living. Because, and here's the great conceit that we don't want to acknowledge is a conceit, and if we would, it would change the whole way we look at immigration. We like to think of our ancestors, those of us of European descent, as having been these noble pioneers, right? You know what we were? We were the losers of Europe. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I'm not trying to be hateful. I'm just being honest. Our ancestors were the losers of their respective countries, not the winners. Like we say things like, my family came over on the Mayflower. Okay, you might not want to brag about that. Do you have any idea who was on the Mayflower? Let me just tell you who wasn't on the Mayflower. The king. The king was not on the Mayflower. Nobody that the king knew or liked or had ever been invited to his house was on that boat. The losers are the ones who left. The winners did not leave. Why would you leave if you were winning? Do you understand? We weren't noble. We weren't pioneers. We weren't special. We were the criminals, the convicts, the folks that couldn't feed their family. We were the losers. There was never a time in the 1600s when there was some British father who walked into the kitchen that morning and said to his family, you know, I know we're doing pretty well right now. I mean, we got this big house, right? We got all this gold. And we were at the king's palace, like just last week. You remember that, children? It was brilliant, right? You were hanging out with the king's kids, like having a great time. It was fantastic, right? It was fantastic. I know, it's fantastic. We're having this wonderful life. We got all this, but Daddy has an idea. Here's my idea. Now just stick with me. Just stick with me. I know it's going to sound a bit crazy, but just stick with me. I think what we ought to do is just leave all this behind and get on a boat. A rickety old ship. I don't even know if it's seaworthy. Honestly, I don't even know. Like, it might sink. Like, we might be eaten by sharks. We might die of scurvy on the way over there. I have no idea if we will survive this journey, but children, it will be an adventure. Okay, that shit did not happen. Right? That did not happen. The winners did not leave. And if we would just acknowledge that, like, think about the liberatory, revelatory impact of just acknowledging that your people came for the same damn reason that everybody who's coming across that border is coming. Then you could see them and you could see you and them, and we wouldn't have this us and them divide that says somehow we're coming for principle and they're coming to take advantage. Everyone who leaves where they're from is doing it for the same reason. Nobody likes to move. You know that most people in this country will live and die within 60 miles of the place of their birth? People don't even like to move across town, let alone uproot everything that they know, everything they've ever been, and go to a strange land where they have different customs and different language and different... Nobody does that for shits and giggles. Nobody does that because they just got nothing better going on. They do that because they feel that they have no choice. And the minute that we make it impossible for us to see that that's exactly why our folks came as well, is the minute that we're able to see the humanity of other people and to stop treating them like pariahs and talking about building walls and deporting people and not allowing people to come in to have the benefits of whatever liberty we think it is that we possess here. Right? But this is all about our ahistoricity. This is all about our unwillingness to look at the past honestly. You know, it's what James Baldwin said back in 1965 in the pages of Ebony magazine. He said, people who imagine that history flatters them, as it does indeed since they wrote it, are impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pin, and they become incapable of seeing themselves or the world. This is where it appears to me, Baldwin said, that most white Americans find themselves impaled. They are dimly or vividly aware that the history they have fed themselves is mainly a lie, but they do not know how to be released from it, and they suffer enormously from the resulting personal incoherence. That is the wisdom we have to understand, because our ahistoricity is damaging the fabric of this country. It is damaging whatever prospects we have for justice and for equity. And so it is time to get off the pin, time to no longer be the butterfly, time to look around and to see the world as it is and to see our role in it as either collaborators or as allies for justice, and to choose the latter. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much. So we have a mic there, and I think there might be one on that side too, or if not, just the one. If you are interested in asking a question and physically able to come to the mic, please do. If you are either not physically able or just don't want to come to the mic, but you feel like you have a really loud voice, I'll be happy to call on you so we can have some questions and have some dialogue. Thank you all for coming. If you do have to leave, I totally understand that. Thank you for hanging out so long. Do me one favor, and that is, as you exit, do it with the least amount of volume possible, and that way the people who ask the questions, you know, can hear the question and they can hear my answer and we can move forward. Thank you all so much. Yes, go ahead.
Enjoyed your speech. You mentioned Baldwin at the very end of your speech, and something that Baldwin said, he said to be black and to be conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be, I hope this is a safe space, because I'm also a student and staff member here, but as I'm listening to the last 75 minutes, and I wanted to laugh, but I didn't find any of it funny.
Right.
Because when I think about the experience of black people and people of color in this country, and I'm not comfortable with saying that the reason for the condition is just white folks Snapchat orientation to history.
Right.
Or white folks taking the blue pill in some way being under some kind of influence.
Right.
Right? Or white people just not being blissfully unaware.
Right.
Right, but they have some devastating implications and
Yeah.
consequences for all the rest of us.
Yep.
And so I'm sitting here and I'm angry.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm enraged. And I was talking to one of my students and said, and it almost makes me, like, to be completely transparent, hateful.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry I'm saying that. I hope my bosses don't kill me for that. But it's how I honestly feel as a black man,
Yeah.
listening to how you enumerate
Yeah.
this system that has over centuries
Yeah.
completely destroyed communities of color.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to say, oh, it's just white folks just don't know their history. It's interesting because I'm watching the History Channel just last night, and there's this
Yeah.
series called The Men That Built America,
Yeah.
Rockefeller, Ford,
Yeah, yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. And it makes me angry
Yeah.
that, I guess, the privilege that a white man can come and talk about race,
Right.
and we're celebrating, but a person of color wouldn't have that reception, right? And so, what advice, I guess, would you give to a black man or another person of color in America who's conscious and is constantly having to absorb
Yeah.
that rage?
Right. Two things. One, thank you very much for sharing. Thank you very much for sharing your perspective. And I definitely want to be incredibly clear that I don't think the only issue is white obliviousness, blue pill, Snapchat history. Obviously, there is also an incredible possessive investment in whiteness, right? As George Lipsitz has called it and others have talked about it, there is an incredible investment in anti-black racism and the destruction of black and brown bodies, right? And that is both a psychological and a material reality that has to be understood. The reason that I focus on the part that I focus on in environments like this is because I think, and I could be wrong in this, and I'm certainly open to being thought wrong and proven wrong, I think that in environments like this, where we're on a college campus with a lot of, young folks, traditional age college students in particular, are relatively young, and have not had to think very much about this, that obliviousness has been so structured for them, perhaps by older folks who had that clear investment and they knew exactly what they were doing, right? But now that's been passed on to a newer generation of white people who I do think are stuck in what Baldwin referred to as this sort of butterfly on a pin kind of situation. That is not, however, and this is important to point out, obliviousness is not innocence. Right? So the fact that one is ignorant of something does not make one innocent for one's ignorance. It does not mean that one is not culpable. It does not mean that one is not on the hook. And I would never want anyone to think that the fact that I say much of it is about structured obliviousness, whether it's with racism, sexism, or any other system of oppression, that somehow excuses the ignorance. There comes a point where it no longer can serve as an explanation or an excuse. It has to be something that we then learn to move through and learn, as I said, to actually hear what you just said exactly the way that you said it. Or even more, what you just said wasn't harsh at all. I felt bad that you felt the need to apologize because you shouldn't have to apologize for a damn thing that you just said. You should have been able to say it 5 times more raw than you did and not have to apologize, right? And I also don't want to be in any way misunderstood. The reason that I use humor is merely a pedagogical tool, and I know that it does not work for everyone, and I don't mean to demean the seriousness of the issue. I do not mean to suggest that any of this is funny. The only thing that I think humor can do for us, whether it is from me or anyone else who's commenting on issues of oppression, right, is that when you're dealing with really heavy, painful shit, from a purely pedagogical perspective, I know from 20 years of seeing it happen that being able to take that into your body and do something constructive with it is more likely for people when they're able to breathe, and sometimes laughter and humor allows that, but I never want it to drift so far into that I don't come back with serious, important analysis either. So I try to mix the two, and sometimes I don't get the mix right, and that's on me. That's my shit. And so you're absolutely right to say that it's not funny, and I don't need people to laugh or or to be into that at all. It is a pedagogical tool. It may not be the best one. It's one that I found to be effective, but it is not meant to in any way diminish the seriousness, the true tragic seriousness and devastation of this system that I'm addressing. As far as what I would say to people of color in terms of how to respond to this rage and how to move through this system and not die, I mean, essentially, because that's what the system's meant to do, right? It's meant to destroy people. That's why it was set up the way it was set up. On the one hand, it's very hard, right, for me to give real practical 1 through 10 advice to people of color, because if my advice sucks, I'm not the one that pays the price for it. So I'm always very cautious, right? I actually think the best advice I can give to people of color is to trust your instincts when it comes to understanding this system and how to respond to it. What's amazing about all the uprising that's happening right now in this country is that it's being led by people of color who are not particularly sweating what white people think. Right? They're not particularly concerned about whether or not their voice is, spoken, if their words are spoken in a mild way. They're not particularly concerned whether they're being polite. They're not particularly concerned whether folks are ready to hear it. And that is a beautiful and empowering thing, because what it means is that folks of color are saying, we will make you hear this on our terms. And that, I think, is the best advice that I can give, is to pay, just when you look at what folks of color are doing, and I don't just mean Black Lives Matter folks, I mean those folks in Tucson that are fighting for La Raza studies that was taken from them in the Tucson Unified School District, the Dreamers who are doing all this great work around immigration. They're all standing up, casting aside this notion of respectability politics that says there's one way to do it, there's one way to say it, you have to dress a certain way, look a certain way, sound a certain way, make white people comfortable. I think the beauty of this current moment is that people of color are trusting their instincts and their gut and are acting from the perspective of having to survive, acting on the basis of what Baldwin referred to as that constant rage, but in the same kind of way that Baldwin was counseling be done at that time and that he was part of. So I think the best advice is to not worry about what white folks think. I'm not saying that strategy doesn't matter, but what I'm saying is people of color can't constantly second guess what white folks are going to do, just like women can't constantly second guess what men are going to think when they speak out against rape culture. At some point, folks who are marginalized have to insist that their voice will be heard in their own tone and in their own way. And then it's up to me, as a white person, to deal with my people so that they can hear it, right? That's my job. That's not your job. Your job is not to convince white people of anything. You got way too much shit to deal with on a day-to-day as a person of color in this country to obsess about what I do and don't hear and what other white people do and don't hear. My job as a white person, I believe, one of those jobs, is to work with other white folks to get them to a place where they can hear that rage expressed and not be afraid of it, not be knocked off stride by it, but be encouraged by it and actually connect with that. But that can never be your job. There's not enough hours in the day, enough minutes in the hour for you to really focus on that. So that means for the white folks in the room, we got to deal with our people. And this is what SNCC told white folks in 67, 68 when they asked white folks to step out of SNCC, was you need to go work with your people. We'll deal with our folks, you deal with your folks, and then we can get back together again and work together. But we can't really work together if you're not talking to your people. So right now, I tell white folks they need to focus mostly on challenging other white folks, whether that's family, whether that's colleagues, whether that's classmates. And that doesn't mean we don't join with people of color, but we join with people of color on their terms when asked in. And so, I just think trust your instincts, know that it isn't really about how white people hear you. And I think sometimes that can be somewhat freeing, because over the years, I've particularly in a college environment, right, where there's a real investment in saying things a certain way, right? There's a whole academic tone that one is supposed to take when one talks about these issues. It's a very disembodied kind of tone. It's a narrative that's very intellectual. And I think sometimes there's a place for that, but genocide and destruction of people is not an intellectual exercise. It's not an abstract academic concept. And sometimes we have to make space, even in those spaces where we overvalue calm, reasonable, quote unquote, discussions. We have to make space for the expression of real pain and real anger and real outrage, because we ought to be outraged by this. And if the academy can't allow for that, if the academy can't allow you to stand up and to say what you said without having to worry about, a supervisor seeing you say it, that's a problem. And we all have to be the ones creating an environment where that doesn't happen, right? So that part is not just on you, that's on all of us, right? Yeah.
Hello. So I have a question. This is more of an observation, I guess. I'm finishing up my first semester in a doctoral program, and this semester we had a class centered on diversity where we looked at colorblindness and white privilege. And an observation I've had of just not colleagues in the classroom, but colleagues also in the university setting, is that the term white privilege has become almost an empowerment term for white people. I wanted to know if you've had this experience and what maybe we can do to, I guess, take it back, to have them understand the meaning of what white privilege is.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and I have noticed in the last couple of years, and I've actually been trying to get away from the language of white privilege in my own work, referring rather to white supremacy, of which white privilege is a part, right? But that's a subset of a larger systemic truth. And there's also now this new term that folks are starting to use, Robin DiAngelo and others create this term, white fragility, right? Which is sort of the weird flip side of white privilege. And I think one of the ways that we can perhaps begin to problematize privilege, because you're right, I think some people hear it and it's almost like, oh, good, right? It's like, I want more of that, Or how do I keep it? Because after all, that's what our culture tells us, right? If you have an edge, this society tells you to keep it, not to give it away, not to share it, right? So one of the ways, I think, is to contrast it with fragility. There was this interesting study that came out last month, a couple of weeks back, and it was from the National Academy of Sciences. I think it was two researchers did all this research on mortality rates, and what they found, right, you may have seen this in the news, there was this weird thing where, for the most part, mortality rates tend to go down over time as medicine, moves forward and science moves forward. And this has certainly been true for the dominant group. White mortality rates consistently dropping. Now, for people of color, they're sort of all over the map. Sometimes they drop, sometimes they go up. In the most recent period that they were studying, which was like 1999 to 2013, they found that there was a strange increase in mortality for working class white folks without college degrees between the ages of 45 and 54, and that this spike in mortality, excess death, was disproportionately caused by suicide, by narcotics, particularly opioid, heroin addiction, right, or by heavy alcoholism, cirrhosis of the liver, things caused by heavy drinking. Now, there were some other causes too, stress-related, hypertension-related diseases, but a lot of it was this sort of self-inflicted drug, alcohol abuse, and or suicide. And so the question is why, right? Why would this demographic, this outlier because all the other white mortality numbers dropped, right? If you were college educated, the numbers continued to drop. If you were younger, the numbers continued to drop. If you were over 54, they dropped. But that mid-range, 45 to 54, working class, no degree, major increase, they found an excess death number of about 500,000 people over that 13 years. Now, before I say what I think that's about, let me point out, it's interesting that became a news story. 500,000 excess dead white people over 14 years, because every single year, according to the CDC, there are about 85,000 excess deaths in the black community that cannot be explained except for unequal healthcare access, disproportionate exposure to toxic chemicals in neighborhoods, et cetera, right? So that's, 85,000 a year over that 14 years is 1.12 million or something. That didn't make the news, right? 500,000 dead white folks, that makes the news. So that too is about privilege and supremacy. But what I think is interesting about that research is, what does it say? Because at first when it came out, a lot of people wrote to me, like literally in the last 2 weeks, I'm getting emails, well, here's your white privilege. Look, white people are dying at excess numbers. What kind of privilege is that? But my argument would be that in fact, precisely the reason why those numbers spiked of suicide, narcotics abuse, heavy drinking is precisely because, and why among uncollege educated, middle-aged white folks, particularly white men, it's precisely because that's the group more than any group that has been told all of their life that it was going to be okay. They were going to be better off than their parents. All they had to do was work hard. And always historically that had been true, but now we've had an economic meltdown that has hit working class people especially hard, of all colors, right? We have manufacturing jobs that are gone, so these guys that would have been able to get a good job 35, 40 years ago and support a family can't. And unlike people of color, who always knew that it was going to be a grind, right? People of color never had the luxury of thinking, hey, if I just play by the rules and do what I need to do and work hard, it'll be okay. No person of color believed that. They all know that it's a grind and that there are going to be obstacles that have nothing to do with their own effort. But these white guys had been lied to and had the privilege of believing the lie, because that's what whiteness does. It actually convinces you that the system is fair, and if you just play by the rules, it'll work out. So when they discover, much to their surprise, that that's not the way the world is, they don't know how to cope with that. And so now you see increased likelihood of suicide, increased drug use, increased drinking, to anesthetize the pain of having to deal with the real world. I'm not saying that we should therefore say, oh, cry crocodile tears for white folks who are dying in excess number. What I'm saying is that we need to link that dysfunction, that fragility that is leaving them very unprepared for setback, in ways that people of color are never unprepared for setback. People of color have had to get ready for setback always, right? But white folks, even working class folks, could really believe, like, next, my kids will be better off and their kids will be better off. And now they're wondering about that. And so I think we have to link fragility to privilege so that we can say to people, on the one hand, you have these enormous advantages unearned that give you huge benefits and a huge head start over other people and come at their expense. On the other hand, this shit will kill you. Right? This is toxic. This is not healthy. This is not sustainable. In other words, trying to make the case that inequality and systems of oppression, even when you're not the target, you can be the collateral damage of that, right? You can be the collateral damage of a system that you thought was going to work for you, and 9 times out of 10 it does. But that 1 time out of 10 that it falls, because all systems break down, all machines break down, the minute that happens, you don't know how to cope. So I think if we talk about it that way, it becomes something that people can begin to think, how can we change this, not just for other people's sake as some act of charity, right? But how do we change this for all of our sake as a matter of justice, right? It becomes a self-help thing for white folks as well as a justice thing, yeah?
Thank you.
Yeah. Are we done? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. This was a fabulous event. I hope you'll check out the White Privilege Room. We'll call it the White Superiority Room next year. But thank you for coming, and have a great day.
Thanks,
Thank you.